So first, before we talk about the features of the release, let's talk a little bit about releases of Clover in general, so that you know what you can expect next. Typically, we release 4 releases every year. These are roughly quarterly, so you can expect next release somewhere around the end of the March. That will be called CloverDX 5.6, and then every 3 months we'll have another release. So we are just about 3 weeks into availability of CloverDX 5.5. In general, we also release 1 or more bug fix releases for each major release, and these releases stay up to date and supported for about 2 years. And so you can expect a lot more from Clover in coming months, and for Clover 5.6, we'll again do similar webinar like this one. Now, without spending too much time on that, let's go and talk a little bit about CloverDX 5.5. There have been few bigger features in the release, and of course, we've already made the changes to many other things. The biggest thing that we've delivered in CloverDX 5.5 is something we call data apps. This is a feature that allows you to give your business users a very simple and visual interface so that they can run anything they need in Clover without actually having to run the designer or log into to the server UI, which is quite complex if you just want to run a single job. Another relatively large feature is what we call a support package. This is something that allows your IT team to communicate a bit more effectively with our CloverCARE team so that you can get your issues resolved much quicker and shorten the time it needs for like getting the information across our support team. And finally, one of the last things I'll show today is our increased support for containerization, or rather automation with regards to containers, and improved project sharing features that allow you to much easier share your code with your colleagues or other team members. Of course, as usually, full release notes with details of everything that we have changed in this release can be found at our web pages. You can see the link at the bottom of the slide. I actually recommend you having a look at that since we provide quite a lot of details about everything that's been changed and that might affect your existing projects. With that said, let's have a look at the data apps, the first feature that I'll show today. This is a feature that builds on top of what we've delivered before in data services and basically allows you to create a very nice and simple user interface for each data service that you have. It does not require any code or any extra code compared to what you already have in your data services. And it allows you to very easily give access to your business users or non-technical users to run something in Clover, regardless of whether it is a simple job or something that requires more parameters and requires a lot of time to finish. Data apps themselves are actually quite simple when you look at the architecture of how they work. As I mentioned, they are very easy for your users to access because the only thing they need is a browser. So they log in into what we call data application catalog, where they have a list of applications that they can see. You can control what different users see through user account permissions, just like you can control everything else in Clover. And once users select the application they want to use, they are presented with a simple and automatically generated user interface that allows them to enter all kinds of parameters that the data service needs. Data services actually power the backend of the data apps. So when you run a data app and provide the parameters it needs, it will in the end run as a data service that can access all functionality of Clover, whether you need to work with databases, files, or some sort of cloud-based resources. You can access all of that and very easily expose through simple interface to your users. Data apps can, of course, return data back to your users, either as a simple status that something has succeeded or maybe there was an error, or they can return files so that your users can, for example, download reports directly from Clover, or data apps can send emails or interface with anything else that you can access in Clover. Let's have a look at the feature itself, how it works. I'll start with the server. So the easiest way of accessing data apps is simply from the login screen of CloverDX console. So there is a link for that. If you click on that, you'll be taken into the form where you can log in into the data apps catalog. So I'll log in as my user. And you are presented with a list of applications that the user can see. In my case, I have just 5 applications, but there is no limit into how many you can deploy or how complex they can be. When I select an application, I'm presented with a simple user interface that allows me to enter all the parameters that the application needs. I can have descriptions for all parameters, all descriptions of the whole application. For example, the one that I have selected allows me to get an HR report from a simple data warehouse that keeps track of a person's activities. This report has 2 parameters, reporting range. So I can select, for example, January 1st to January 31st and just run the application. This is now kicking off a data service in the backend. Data service itself is crunching all the numbers for me. It's connecting to the warehouse database, computing the report. And in my case, the report is returned as an Excel file, which I can download later. As I mentioned before, it's also possible to return different kinds of statuses over here. You can, for example, just return an OK status that something happened, or you can provide just a simple message to your users. In my case, this is an Excel report that I can download and view directly on my computer. So you can see that it's very easy to use this to provide even quite complicated reports like this one, where we are using an Excel template to populate the whole report so that we get nice pictures and everything. Let's now have a look at slightly different use case. If I go back again, it's of course possible to have different kinds of parameters. So for example, I can also upload files through data apps. This is such a manual data load where I can select a file. In my case, I need to go over here. And let's select something from here. All right, and I can have optional parameters. In this case, the parameter allows me to override the date of the load. If I keep it empty, the day will be used, so I just keep it empty because I'm fine with the date. And again, this is a way of showing something simpler to your users. And in here, you can actually see how this is powered by data services, because the default output type for a data service is a JSON. So in my case, I'm providing a very simple JSON on the output with just the status of the data load that shows me how many records were read from an input file, how many inserts and updates have been done in a database. And just as before, since this is a file, I can also download this, although it would probably not mean that much. So this is the user interface that you can present to your users. And as I mentioned, they can have any number of such applications. Of course, we've had to make changes in how the data services work a little bit to support this kind of functionality. The simplest way of seeing those changes is to look at the designer. The data services themselves work the same way as before. So you get to design them exactly in the same way. The only changes relate to how the parameters are handled. We have redesigned the dialog over here to allow you to provide different kinds of parameters that are more natural for that kind of user interface, like I have shown, rather than the user interface, or rather than accessing just the data service itself. It is now very easy to provide files because we now have a separate special data type for text or binary files. So if you want to provide or have users upload a file, you can very easily do that. And besides that, the data services work exactly the same. So the functionality that allow you to publish REST APIs to data services has not been affected in any way. Another relatively large change to how data services work is in the server console itself. When we go into the data services, we now have a new status icon that shows us that a data app has been enabled. And this is basically the way how you can get user interface for something. If you remember how the UI looked before, we had a Swagger UI automatically generated based on parameters of your data service, where you can click a button to have your data service tested. This has now been replaced with automatically generated UI that looks a little bit better, that looks as the actual application. And you can enable or disable application with just a single checkbox. Right? So enabling or disabling this checkbox enables or disables the application itself. You do not have to write a single line of code to deploy an application into the application catalog over here. So if you already have data services that your users are using, you can now give them a very simple way of running those and have a very nice interface to upload their files or change parameters. Besides that, everything else stays the same. So monitoring data services there, error reporting and everything else has remained the same. So no changes are needed to data services that you already might be running in your environment. The second feature that I mentioned at the beginning is what we call a support package. This is something that allows your IT team to more effectively communicate with our CloverCARE support team. This is a single-click way of getting all interesting information about your server so that you can attach it to the tickets you might raise with our support team. Just as with data apps, everything related to the server is accessed from the server UI. So in this case, you can generate support package from the system info configuration screen. You can also customize what's in the package, but by itself, it's just a zip archive that contains interesting information about server settings, its logs from the application server, and few more files. You can actually click on that and have a look at what is in the file. If you don't want to publish some of that information, you can easily delete it. Or for example, if some of the log files are too large to be uploaded through the support system, you can delete them from there as well. And then you can see that this is what's in the file. Everything is plain text file or log files in well-known formats. So there is nothing hidden there, nothing is encrypted, and you can very easily see exactly what kind of information you are providing to our support. And this is something that we'd like you to keep doing when you are sending tickets to our support team, because it will often save several rounds of discussion of our support guys having to ask for your server settings and so on, so that they can help you resolve the issues you might be having with your server. All right, and let's have a look at another. Several of the improvements that you've made in 5.5 relate to how you can share your projects and how you can deploy them, whether on-premise, in the cloud, or in Docker containers. The first feature that we implemented is something that allows you to very easily import projects from a website or from a URL. This is something that you can get when you just use drag and drop from a website. For example, this is one of our sample pages where we provide a small project with sample code that shows you how to connect to Snowflake. And I can just drag and drop the URL, drop it into the designer. It will download the project for me and automatically deploy it as a project in the workspace. And on top of that, as another feature that we've implemented is that it will automatically show me a README file if it is included in the project. In my case, the README file is provided as a markdown file, so I can get relatively nice and simple formatting over there. But you can also provide a plain text file if you don't want to write markdown, or if you want to get a little bit more fancy and provide more visual README, you can also use HTML. So all three of those will be displayed if you include them in the project. This is something that can allow your users very quickly see what they are supposed to do with the project. For example, in case of my example that I'm showing, I can see installation steps that tell me that I need to download the JDBC driver and so on. And so this way, you can give someone a project or just a link to a project, and they will have much easier way of figuring out what to do with it once it's deployed. The second part of the deployment automation or improvements related to that relates to what you can do on the server with sandbox settings. As you all know, once you deploy something into Clover, it becomes a sandbox, and you can have quite a lot of settings associated with that sandbox. For example, you can have scheduled jobs, you can have data services, or even listeners, and all kinds of other things that relate to settings of the sandbox itself. Up until now, you've had to manually recreate those settings whenever you wanted to deploy that sandbox somewhere else, which either required you to export complete configuration of the server and modify it by hand, or write some sort of a manual specifying what you need to configure on the server. This is no longer necessary because you can export sandbox configuration directly into the sandbox. From sandbox's module, we have a new button called export configuration that creates an XML file called sandbox configuration in the sandbox root. And you can see what's in this file because as everything else in Clover, this is an XML and it gives you the schedules, even listeners, data services, and everything else that relates to jobs in the sandbox. You can see that, for example, in the case of the warehouse, I have a number of data services enabled. I have one scheduler entry and nothing else. And the best part about this is that if you deploy a sandbox like this, when a sandbox contains configuration file like this into a server, it will automatically get loaded and the settings are automatically applied by your server. This happens whenever you load the sandbox by creating it from the designer, for example, through drag and dropping the project from a website like I did before, or even if you do something like create a new Docker image where the sandbox is included. When the server starts for the first time, it will scan all sandboxes that are there and import all their configuration. So this is something that will allow you to automate your deployments of the server even more compared to what you've been able to do so far. Of course, in CloverDX 5.5, we've also made performance improvements. The first and the biggest one is the improvement of performance related to working with S3 buckets. So far, before 5.5, we've had S3 bucket listing or file listing operation as a blocking operation, meaning that if you, for example, used the list files component on an S3 bucket and had components afterwards, it had to list complete content of the bucket before proceeding any further. This has been changed, and S3 is now a streaming operation, meaning that as soon as first file name becomes available from S3, it gets sent further down the stream to process. In some cases, especially in buckets that contain tens or hundreds of thousands of items, this can mean significant improvements in processing times of the jobs that need to work with those buckets. The second quite visible performance improvement relates to memory usage of CloverDX jobs. What we've changed is that we've lowered stack reservation on the threads. And if you know how Clover runs, that we run quite a lot of threads. Basically, every component in any job that you run requires at least one thread. So what we've done is to reduce the stack requirements for each of those threads. And in some use cases, either when you run a large number or thousands of jobs in parallel, or when you have a lot of components in your jobs, this can result in significantly decreased memory usage for your jobs, meaning you can fit more of them onto smaller servers. This will, of course, be different depending on each deployment because each virtual machine implementation behaves, or JVM implementation behaves slightly differently, but you should see the difference in all supported Java implementations. And as usually, we've had a number of changes that affect compatibility of CloverDX with previous versions. We strive to keep the server compatible on Clover Designer as well, but sometimes there are just changes that we have to make. In this case, the biggest one was the unification of null handling in JSON reader and JSON extract. Before, the components were behaving a little bit unevenly, not doing exactly the same thing when you parsed the same file. Sometimes they were producing missing attributes as null values, sometimes as empty strings. This has now been unified and both produce empty strings or nulls in the same circumstances. So regardless of which component you use, you'll now get exactly the same output out of that. This might require you to actually go back to your jobs and review whether you are not relying on the behavior of one or the other component in a certain way. So just review your jobs carefully if you are using these two. XML reader and XML extract have not been affected by this change at all. So if you are just using XML, no changes are needed there. And other changes related to MongoDB, specifically to MongoDB execute component. In MongoDB 4.2, Mongo dropped support for a function called eval, which was internally used by MongoDB execute component to run your scripts. So if you are using new Mongo releases, 4.2 or newer, you will not be able to use this component and the component has been deprecated. If you load up an older driver before 4.2, right, so 4.0 or older, and have older Mongo release, you can still find the component in the deprecated section. We are actually working on a new component to replace this one. So in the future, we'll have an equivalent component even for newer Mongo releases. And finally, we have dropped support for Internet Explorer 11 and for Microsoft Edge in Server Console. They will still work, but they are no longer officially supported. So we recommend everyone to switch to either Mozilla Firefox or Google Chrome for accessing the server. No other changes have been done, so for now you should be fine. They will work, except you might have some small visual issues, or in the future, the support will probably be removed completely. And that's everything from my side. Thank you for your attention. Back to you, Tessa.
Thanks, Branyo. I hope you all found that useful. We've got some questions that have come in, so I'm going to pass them over to you. So someone has asked, if you upload new content to an existing sandbox, including an updated sandbox configuration XML, will it apply those settings, as in overwrite existing ones?
No, this only applies once. So for every sandbox, the server remembers whether the settings file has been loaded or not, and it will not replace the old one. So if you need to redo it, you have to remove the file and recreate it again. And so you cannot just replace the file and have it apply automatically.
Okay, thank you. We have another one, data apps. How are usernames, passwords managed? Is it the same as server users? And can you make users with access only to data apps?
Yes, it's the same as server users. So you can configure access to anything you want in the server. And if you'd like, you can prohibit users from accessing anything else besides data apps. The permissions are for now shared with data services. So if you give your users access to data services, they will be able to use data apps as well. Right? But you can prevent them from seeing anything else, like, for example, execution history or anything else.
Thanks, Branyo. We've got another one. How would you recommend publishing data apps in a secure way?
Right, so given that this gives your users direct access to the server, even though they might not see the whole environment, they are still accessing the server, you should be careful about publishing those, especially if you want to publish them on the internet. You should place them behind something that limits user access, for example, a proxy or some sort of other forwarding web server, so that you do not expose CloverDX Server directly to the internet. Besides that, you can use like your basic settings with usernames, so with user accounts, so that your users only get access to what they need. So when publishing data services, we recommend to only create accounts for those users that actually need them and don't give them access to anything else, so that they don't get confused by the server UI if they log in into that by mistake, or break something in the worst case.
Thank you. One last question. So this is like a Swagger UI.
Yes, kind of. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's generated from the data service. So you currently do not have any control in how exactly the UI looks like. You can reorder the parameters, for example, to group them into categories and so on, but you cannot change the design at all. It's all generated based on the parameters of your data services. And the Swagger UI has been deprecated, and you can now use the same UI for data apps. Even if the data app is not enabled, it just appears as a sidebar in the data services section of the server UI.
Thanks for the questions. If there aren't any more, I think we'll wrap up then. If you do find that you do have some more questions, you can email us at hello@cloverdx.com. So with that, thank you, Branyo, and thank you for sharing all the features and updates. Thanks to everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at our next webinar.